Rain lashed against the cracked windows of the isolated cabin, its roof groaning under the weight of the storm. Inside, a young pregnant woman named Emily lay sprawled on the wooden floor, her clothes damp with sweat and rain, her breathing shallow. Her once vibrant face was pale, bruised, and smudged with dirt, strands of hair clinging to her forehead. Her hand rested protectively on her swollen belly, barely conscious, as if her last instinct was to shield the life growing inside her. The flickering light from a faulty lantern cast long shadows across the walls, revealing the signs of struggle: a broken chair, claw marks on the door, a knocked-over tin of food now empty. Outside, the deep growls and howls of wild dogs echoed through the night, each snarl reverberating through the silence like a death sentence. Their yellow eyes glowed in the dark, circling the cabin like vultures around a dying prey. Rain soaked their fur, but they remained persistent, pawing at the wooden steps, occasionally leaping against the door that stood as the only barrier between Emily and the savage world outside. The pack had not eaten in days. They were restless, aggressive, and too close for comfort. Unseen by Emily, a figure stood at a distance, partly hidden behind a tree, his silhouette only revealed when lightning cracked the sky. He watched the cabin with sharp intensity, eyes narrowed, fists clenched. He wasn't just an onlooker, he had come for a reason. The camera slowly zoomed in on the glass window where one of the dogs jumped against the door, barking viciously. The figure didn't flinch. He exhaled, whispered something under his breath, and stepped back into the shadows. As the screen darkened, bold white text appeared: "She was left to die, but fate had other plans." The voiceover, calm yet chilling, echoed in the silence: "When family turns into monsters, even wild beasts look kind." Emily was 26, soft-spoken and kind, the kind of woman whose presence was calming even in chaos. Raised in a modest small-town household where love was abundant but money was tight, she never dreamed of marrying into wealth. Yet life had its strange turns, and love had its own path. She met Ryan Whitmore at a charity fundraiser in the city, a charming, well-dressed man with a quiet smile and an effortless elegance that masked the shadows of the family he came from. Their whirlwind romance felt like something out of a movie: candlelit dinners, surprise road trips, long conversations under stars. When he proposed, Emily said yes without hesitation, believing love was enough to bind them through any storm. She didn't know then what the name Whitmore truly meant. The Whitmores were old money, a family draped in luxury but devoid of warmth. From the moment Emily stepped into their massive, cold marble estate, she felt it: the eyes watching her, the judgments whispered in passing, the subtle ways Margaret Whitmore, Ryan's mother, made her feel less. Charles, the father, barely spoke to her, and when he did, it was with the dry tone of a businessman speaking to a servant. They wore their wealth like armor and treated outsiders like dust beneath their feet. Emily, with her small-town roots and second-hand charm, didn't belong in their curated world. Still, she tried. She smiled through dinners, offered to help in the kitchen, wrote thank-you notes for things she never received. But kindness wasn't currency in the Whitmore mansion, power was. When Ryan was suddenly offered a prestigious project overseas, it was his parents who encouraged, even insisted, he take it. Emily, 5 months pregnant and glowing with the excitement of motherhood, expected he'd say no, stay by her side. But the Whitmores promised to take care of everything in his absence. Naively, Emily believed them. The moment Ryan's flight took off, the tone in the house shifted. The rooms felt colder, the silence louder. Her in-laws no longer pretended. They gave orders, not suggestions. Meals were late. Her doctor appointments were rescheduled. She was moved to a guest wing under the pretense of privacy, but it was isolation. Her phone calls to Ryan were intercepted or timed. Slowly, methodically, they chipped away at her comfort, her confidence, and her safety. And Emily, once hopeful and loved, began to understand she wasn't living with family, she was living with enemies. It didn't take long for Emily to realize that Margaret and Charles Whitmore were not simply cold, they were calculating. In the polished, sterile world of the Whitmores, everything had a purpose, and Emily's presence no longer served one. With Ryan gone, the mask of civility slipped. Their smiles vanished, and what remained was ice in human form. Margaret's eyes, once cool and dismissive, now studied Emily like she was a chess piece, inconvenient, in the way, disposable. Charles didn't bother hiding his disdain. He rarely acknowledged her, except with curt commands or passive-aggressive remarks. For weeks, Emily tried to convince herself that the tension was just stress, that her pregnancy was making her overly sensitive. But all doubts shattered one night when she passed by the study door, left slightly ajar. Inside, she heard her in-laws speaking in low voices. "She won't make it to the 9th month," Margaret whispered sharply. Emily froze. Her heart thundered in her chest as she leaned closer, barely breathing. "Ryan's too soft to see it, but she's a problem. Once she's gone, the estate stays clean, no bastard child tying up the inheritance," Charles replied coldly. Margaret added, "Let the wilderness do what we can't. Quiet. No mess." Emily stumbled back, clutching the wall for support, her stomach tightening with fear. They weren't just cruel, they were planning something horrific. The very next day, Margaret approached her with a saccharine smile and a voice laced with fake concern. "Emily, darling, you've been so tense. We've arranged for you to stay at our countryside rest house. It's peaceful. No noise. Just what a mother-to-be needs." Emily hesitated, but the growing paranoia made her believe she had no choice. Refusing might trigger them. Maybe a break from this mansion would help, she told herself. Maybe she was overthinking. They drove her out themselves, not with care, but with control. The car sped down winding roads until it reached the edge of the estate, into the woods. There, hidden behind thick trees and overgrown grass, stood an old wooden cabin. Its windows were dusty, the porch creaked under weight, and the place looked like it hadn't been lived in for years. "We'll have staff check on you," Charles lied. "Rest. Don't strain yourself," Margaret added, before locking the door behind her. No one came. No staff, no food deliveries, no calls. Her phone mysteriously lost signal. At night, the sounds began, strange howls, scratching at the walls, distant growls that grew closer each evening. The pantry was nearly empty. Rain leaked through the roof. Emily began rationing crackers and stale canned beans. She wrapped herself in blankets, trying to keep warm, fear growing inside her like a second heartbeat. Her instincts screamed this was no mistake, this was a trap. Something was out there. Something they wanted to reach her before help ever could. The first night, Emily convinced herself it was just the wind. The growls were faint, distant, carried on the storm as if nature itself was groaning. But by the second night, the scratching at the door became harder to ignore. Something was out there, multiple somethings. Heavy bodies moved through the brush, low snarls rumbled just beyond the windows, and claws scraped against the wood with deliberate aggression. She sat on the floor, wrapped in a worn blanket, clutching her belly and holding her breath every time a shadow passed the window. Her heartbeat echoed louder than the thunder, her fear a steady pulse in her throat. There was no doubt anymore, she wasn't alone out here, and whatever was outside wasn't going away. As the terror grew, her mind wandered to the stories she had heard in passing when she first arrived at the Whitmore estate. The family had once owned a group of dogs, large, aggressive breeds they had supposedly rescued from illegal dog fights. Margaret bragged about them at dinner once, calling them natural-born protectors. They were kept in kennels behind the estate, fed raw meat, and trained to be loyal to the family. But one night, a neighbor complained, and the dogs were moved quietly, without explanation. No one ever asked where they went. Now, the truth hit Emily like a gut punch. These weren't just strays. These were the Whitmore dogs, forgotten, abandoned, and left to survive in the wilderness. No more trainers. No more cages. Just survival. And after months of fending for themselves, they were no longer domesticated animals. They had become feral, vicious, territorial creatures. Their hunger made them bold. Their memory of humans made them dangerous. She recalled Margaret's voice, from just days ago, with chilling clarity. Let nature decide. Emily hadn't thought much of it then. Maybe she meant the weather. Maybe she meant time. But now she knew. Margaret wasn't being poetic. She was being literal. They had thrown her into a game of survival, believing the wild dogs would do the dirty work they couldn't. Margaret and Charles had orchestrated this, dressed it up as rest, wrapped it in lies, and delivered her straight to death's doorstep. Outside, another growl rose, closer than before. The doorknob jiggled slightly. The scratching turned into pounding. Emily backed away, whispering to her unborn child, "I won't let them hurt you. I promise." But in her heart, she wasn't sure if promises would be enough. Emily's hands trembled as she tugged at the rusted window latch, desperately trying to force it open. The glass panes were grimy, caked with years of dust and mold, but no matter how hard she pulled, the metal refused to budge. Her panic surged when she realized the window wasn't just stuck, it was barred. Thick iron rods, welded into the frame, blocked any chance of escape. Her breath caught in her throat. One by one, she rushed to every window in the cabin, checking, pulling, pushing, each one the same. Every window locked and barred like a prison cell. She wasn't just isolated. She was trapped. With each passing hour, the hunger worsened. Her belly ached not just from fear but from emptiness. She rummaged through the cabinets again, hoping she missed something, anything. A few stale crackers, a can of beans without a working opener, and half a bottle of water were all she had. She rationed the crackers, eating only one every few hours, forcing herself to chew slowly. When the rain came, she placed a pot beneath the leak in the ceiling, collecting the droplets as they fell, her only source of water. Her throat burned. Her head pounded. But she refused to break. On the fourth night, just after sunset, she heard the unmistakable sound of splintering wood. It wasn't the door this time. It was the back, closer, faster. The dogs had found a weak point. Their growls were no longer distant. They were inside. Snarling, barking, scraping against the floorboards. Emily's heart raced as she grabbed the rusted lantern and sprinted into the bedroom, slamming the closet door shut behind her. She sat in the darkness, panting, holding her belly with both arms. The closet was small and filled with dust, but it had a lock, one of the only things in the house that gave her any sense of control. She twisted the knob until it clicked, then pressed her back against the wall, trying to quiet her breathing as the sound of claws echoed closer. The dogs were in the cabin now. She heard their heavy panting, the low growls, the sniffing. They were searching. Hunting. One of them began scratching at the bedroom door. Her body froze, her muscles tight with fear. She squeezed her eyes shut. And then, from deep within, a memory flickered. Her father's voice, soft but firm, came back to her from a time long gone. She was 10, crying on the porch after getting bullied at school. "You're stronger than you think, Em," he had said, brushing the dirt off her scraped knees. "You got fire in you. You just don't know it yet." The words repeated in her mind like a mantra. Stronger than you think. Stronger than you think. Emily forced herself to breathe. Slowly, deeply. Her baby kicked, small, but sharp, a reminder that she wasn't alone. She wasn't just fighting for herself. Outside the closet, a loud bang shook the doorframe. A dog had launched itself against the bedroom door, and it groaned under the pressure. Emily grabbed a rusty broom handle from the corner and held it like a weapon. Her hands were shaking, but her grip tightened. If they broke through, she'd fight. She would not die in the dark. She would not let them win. This child, this life, was worth every scream, every wound, every desperate breath. She was scared, yes, but in that fear, she found something stronger. Survival. And that, she realized, was the one thing even the wild dogs hadn't expected. Jake Lawson wasn't the kind of man who enjoyed attention, despite being one of the youngest self-made tech millionaires in the country. At 32, he had built and sold 2 startups, earned headlines in Forbes, and vanished from the public eye almost overnight. Most assumed he was off enjoying yachts and private islands, but the truth was far more painful. A year ago, He'd lost his wife, Anna, who had been 7 months pregnant with their first child when a drunk driver ran a red light. The world called it a tragedy. Jake called it the day everything stopped making sense. Since then, he hadn't attended a single event, hadn't opened a laptop, hadn't touched a line of code. Money couldn't fix grief, and even silence didn't heal it, it only muted it for a while. That's why he'd come to the countryside, renting a secluded estate near the edge of the Whitmore property. The trees were dense, the roads unpaved, the cell service spotty, exactly what he needed. He filled his days with books and long walks, avoiding people, talking only to the housekeeper who came twice a week. But the quiet didn't last long. On his second evening, Jake stood on his back porch, sipping lukewarm coffee, when he heard it, a low, guttural howl echoing through the woods. At first, he thought it was a coyote, maybe a wild dog. But then he heard it again. Not one howl, but many. And it was closer than it should have been. Over the next few nights, the howls grew louder. He noticed strange movements near the edge of the forest, flashes of fur, glowing eyes, something pacing in the dark. And just beyond the tree line, barely visible through the fog, was the Whitmore cabin. Jake's instincts stirred. Something wasn't right. Something, or someone, was in danger. One chilly evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon, Jake stood on the balcony of his rustic lodge, binoculars pressed firmly against his eyes. The fading light cast long shadows over the Whitmore estate, but his gaze was fixed beyond the manicured gardens, onto the edge of the dense woods where the old cabin stood. His heart skipped when he spotted a figure, a woman, sitting motionless on the cabin's creaky porch, her form fragile and vulnerable. Surrounding her were several large dogs, their heads low and bodies tense as they paced in tight circles, growling softly under their breath. The sight sent a chill down Jake's spine. His mind raced. Who was this woman? Why was she out here alone, surrounded by wild dogs? Concern grew into a resolve he hadn't felt in months. Without hesitation, he decided to confront the Whitmores. He knew they held power and wealth, but if there was even a chance this woman was in danger, he couldn't stand by. The next morning, Jake approached the Whitmore mansion, the grand iron gates closing ominously behind him. Margaret greeted him with a tight, rehearsed smile that didn't reach her cold eyes. Charles barely glanced up from his newspaper, his demeanor dismissive. Jake's questions about the woman near the cabin were met with curt answers and thinly veiled hostility. "There's no one out there," Margaret said sharply. "You're mistaken." Charles added, "This is private property. You should mind your own business." Their words were a brick wall, but Jake wasn't deterred. Something was terribly wrong. Unable to find help through conventional means, Jake returned to his lodge and turned to his expertise. Pulling out his laptop, he bypassed the estate's security system, something he hadn't done in a long time but couldn't resist. As lines of code streamed across the screen, he gained access to hidden camera feeds scattered across the Whitmore grounds. His breath hitched when he found the feed focused on the cabin. The footage was chilling. Emily appeared inside, pale and weak, clutching her stomach. The dogs circled outside, their snarls growing louder each time the camera shook with their pounding paws. On the other side, he saw glimpses of Margaret and Charles speaking in harsh tones, their faces shadowed but their intentions clear. Emily's desperate attempts to open barred windows, her rationing of stale food, the loneliness etched into every frame, it was a nightmare playing out in real time. The cold cruelty of the Whitmores was undeniable. Jake's fists clenched as he watched the pregnant woman trapped, fighting to survive, while those who should protect her turned their backs. The anger bubbling inside him wasn't just for Emily, it was for every innocent soul suffering behind closed doors. He knew this wasn't just a rescue mission. This was a reckoning. And he was ready to be the one to bring justice. The night Jake chose to make his move was thick with rain, the kind that soaked through clothes in minutes and blurred vision like a curtain. He packed methodically, grabbing everything he might need for a dangerous encounter, a set of tranquilizer darts he'd procured from a licensed veterinarian, a powerful flashlight, climbing rope, and a first aid kit. Each item was placed carefully into his backpack, the weight a constant reminder of the mission ahead. He wasn't a soldier, nor a hero, he was just a man driven by purpose, fueled by the helpless image of Emily trapped behind that cabin door. As thunder rumbled in the distance, Jake double-checked his gear, his face steely and determined. With a deep breath, he stepped out into the storm, pulling his raincoat tight around him. The forest was alive with the sounds of the tempest, branches bending, water rushing through leaves, distant calls of animals stirred awake by the weather. Guided by the small drone buzzing steadily in front of him, its night vision camera feeding him a live view on his handheld device, Jake navigated the slippery terrain. Every step brought him closer to the cabin, closer to danger, but he pressed on. His heart pounded with urgency, failure wasn't an option. As he neared the cabin, the growls began again, low, menacing, and unmistakably close. Suddenly, several wild dogs erupted from the shadows, eyes glowing fiercely in the dark. They lunged at him, teeth bared, their snarls echoing through the rain. Jake froze for a heartbeat before reacting. He reached into his bag, pulling out a handful of meat jerky treats he'd packed as bait. Tossing them to the side, he knelt calmly, speaking softly in a tone meant to soothe and assert control. The dogs hesitated, sniffing the air, their aggression tempered by the unexpected offering. Using slow, deliberate movements, Jake backed toward the cabin door while keeping his voice steady. "Easy, easy," he murmured, hands outstretched. One dog growled but took a treat, then another, until the pack was distracted enough to give him a narrow window. He pulled out the rope, quickly tying a loop around the door handle to secure it behind him. The dogs barked in frustration but didn't charge again immediately, wary of the man who wasn't afraid. Inside, the air was thick with dampness and decay. Jake's flashlight beam swept across the floor, landing on a frail figure curled in the corner. Emily lay unconscious, her skin clammy and pale, her breathing shallow and uneven. A fever burned beneath her flushed cheeks, and dehydration had sapped her strength. His heart clenched painfully as he knelt beside her, gently brushing damp hair from her face. "You're not dying here," he whispered, voice thick with emotion. "Not on my watch." Carefully, Jake checked her pulse and her breathing, then removed the heavy blanket she'd wrapped around herself. He tore a strip from his jacket to fashion a makeshift sling, supporting her head and back. Emily stirred faintly, eyes fluttering open to meet his gaze, a mix of confusion, fear, and a flicker of hope. He smiled gently, reassuring her with soft words. Outside, the dogs continued to circle, but Jake's presence held them at bay. With careful strength, he lifted Emily, bracing her fragile body against his chest. The rescue wasn't over yet, but for the first time in what felt like an eternity, Emily was no longer alone. And Jake, a man broken by his own past, had found a new reason to fight. Jake carried Emily through the muddy forest path, each step slow and careful as the storm began to subside. When they finally reached the gates of his secluded estate, relief washed over him, but he knew the hardest part was still ahead, getting her the care she desperately needed. Inside the warm, softly lit house, he laid her gently on a plush couch and immediately called his trusted private doctor, someone he had relied on during his darkest days. Within minutes, the doctor arrived, bringing medical supplies and calm reassurance. The doctor quickly examined Emily, noting her fever, dehydration, and exhaustion. He administered 4 fluids and medications to stabilize her, while Jake sat quietly nearby, his eyes never leaving her fragile form. The atmosphere was a stark contrast to the cold, harsh cabin she'd endured. Here, soft blankets and gentle voices replaced fear and neglect. As the hours passed, Emily's breathing steadied, and the color slowly returned to her cheeks. When she finally stirred, her eyes fluttered open, filled with confusion and vulnerability. The room was unfamiliar, and it took her a moment to piece together where she was, or more importantly, how she had gotten here. Her gaze met Jake's, a stranger who had become her savior. She tried to speak but found her voice weak, barely more than a whisper. Jake reached out carefully, brushing a damp strand of hair from her face. His voice was soft but steady as he reassured her, "You're safe now, and your baby's okay." Emily blinked, overwhelmed by a flood of emotions, relief, disbelief, and cautious hope. Tears welled up, but she swallowed hard, focusing on the warmth of Jake's presence. In that moment, she realized she had escaped the nightmare that had threatened her life and the life growing inside her. Though the road ahead would be difficult, she wasn't alone anymore. Someone was fighting for her, someone who refused to let her slip through the cracks of cruelty and neglect. And for the first time in what felt like forever, Emily allowed herself to believe that healing was possible. As dawn broke over the quiet countryside, Emily sat nervously in a sterile police interview room, her hands trembling slightly as she recounted the horrors she had endured. With every word she spoke, the weight of her ordeal settled heavier on her chest, but the resolve in her voice grew stronger. She described how her in-laws had isolated her, abandoned her in that decrepit cabin surrounded by wild dogs, and left her to fend for herself while she was 5 months pregnant. The officers listened intently, taking detailed notes, their expressions a mix of disbelief and anger. For Emily, telling her story was both terrifying and liberating, a step toward reclaiming her life. Meanwhile, Jake was already in motion. He had wasted no time assembling his trusted legal team, a group of sharp, relentless attorneys known for taking on tough cases and winning. Armed with the damning drone footage, the hacked security camera recordings, and Emily's powerful testimony, they built a case that left little room for doubt. Jake's team meticulously documented every piece of evidence, from the digital timestamps showing Emily's confinement to the audio capturing the Whitmores' chilling conversations plotting her demise. When the Whitmores were informed of the charges, their response was swift and defiant. Margaret and Charles vehemently denied any wrongdoing, painting Emily as unstable and ungrateful. They insisted the cabin was merely a place for rest and recovery and claimed the dogs were not theirs but wild strays. Their polished lawyers attempted to discredit Emily's account, suggesting motives of inheritance disputes and jealousy. But the tide was turning. Jake's evidence was undeniable. The drone footage clearly showed Emily trapped, the dogs circling menacingly, while the audio revealed the cold cruelty behind closed doors. The truth was irrefutable. The police arrested Margaret and Charles Whitmore on charges of attempted murder and endangerment of an unborn child. The local media quickly caught wind of the case, sensational headlines highlighting the shocking betrayal of family and the miraculous rescue. Public outrage swelled as details emerged, with many expressing disbelief that such cruelty could exist beneath the veneer of wealth and respectability. Emily watched from a distance, still fragile but growing stronger each day, knowing justice was finally within reach. She had faced unimaginable darkness, but now, supported by Jake and her legal team, she was stepping into the light. The battle wasn't over, court proceedings would be long and grueling, but the walls of silence and deception were beginning to crumble. And with every legal document filed and every witness called, the Whitmores' empire of cruelty was unraveling, piece by piece. The courtroom was packed with spectators, the air thick with anticipation as Emily took the stand. Her hands trembled slightly, but her eyes were steady and filled with determination. She recounted every detail with unwavering courage, how she had been betrayed by the very people who were supposed to protect her, abandoned in a cabin surrounded by wild dogs, left to face death while pregnant. Each word was measured but powerful, a testament to her strength and will to survive. The room fell silent, hanging on every sentence as if the truth itself demanded attention. Margaret Whitmore sat across the room, her face twisted into a cruel sneer. When it was her turn to speak, her voice dripped with venom as she spat out, "You were never one of us." The remark, intended to belittle and isolate Emily, only highlighted the cold-hearted nature of the woman who had orchestrated the torment. The judge's eyes narrowed sharply as he responded, his tone firm but calm, "And thank God for that." The courtroom murmured in agreement, sensing the scales of justice tipping in favor of the truth. Witnesses were called, neighbors who heard strange noises, experts who testified about the dangers Emily faced, and medical professionals who described her physical and emotional condition. The evidence was overwhelming. The drone footage, the hacked security tapes, and Emily's own testimony painted a chilling picture of cruelty and neglect. The Whitmores' defense crumbled under the weight of facts and moral outrage. After hours of deliberation, the jury returned with a unanimous verdict, guilty. Margaret and Charles Whitmore were sentenced to over 20 years in prison for attempted murder and endangerment of an unborn child. the courtroom erupted in whispers and gasps as justice was finally served. Emily exhaled slowly, relief washing over her like a tide. The nightmare was over, and the future, though uncertain, held a glimmer of hope. As she left the courtroom, surrounded by supporters and the quiet strength she had reclaimed, Emily knew this was more than just a legal victory. It was a declaration that cruelty would not be tolerated, that even in the darkest moments, resilience could shine through. And for her unborn child, now safe and protected, it was a new beginning born from courage and justice. 6 months later, the hospital room was filled with soft sunlight filtering through white curtains, casting a warm glow over the new life sleeping peacefully in Emily's arms. After months of fear and uncertainty, she had given birth to a healthy baby boy, Lucas. His tiny fingers curled around hers, his breath steady and calm, a living symbol of hope and survival. The journey had been long and arduous, but this moment felt like a miracle, proof that even the darkest storms could give way to new beginnings. Jake arrived quietly, carrying a bouquet of fresh flowers wrapped in simple brown paper. He stepped inside with a gentle smile, careful not to startle the sleeping infant. Emily looked up from the crib, her eyes shining with gratitude and something deeper, a quiet strength forged through shared pain and resilience. "He reminds me of the man who saved us," she said softly, her voice thick with emotion. It wasn't just the baby's striking blue eyes or his stubborn little grip that reminded her of Jake, it was the courage, the kindness, and the unwavering protection he had given when she needed it most. Jake knelt beside the bed, brushing a loose strand of hair from Emily's forehead. "He'll grow up never knowing fear," he promised, his voice steady and full of hope. "Because he has a mother who fought for him, and people who will always stand by him." In that moment, the weight of the past lifted just a little. The scars remained, but so did the promise of a future, one where Lucas would be safe, loved, and free from the shadows that once threatened to consume them. As Emily cradled Lucas close, she allowed herself to dream again. This was their second chance, a story rewritten not by cruelty but by compassion, courage, and the unbreakable bond between a mother and her child. Emily had finally found peace in a quiet small town miles away from the darkness that once consumed her life. The streets were lined with blooming trees, neighbors waved as she walked with Lucas nestled in his stroller, and the air was filled with the simple sounds of children playing and birds singing. It was a world away from the cold Whitmore estate, a fresh start where she could rebuild her life on her own terms. Every day brought new challenges, but also moments of joy, Lucas's first laugh, the warmth of sunlight on her face, the kindness of strangers who never knew the nightmare she'd survived. Here, Emily was no longer a victim, she was a survivor. Jake had kept his promise in more ways than one. Using his resources and connections, he established a shelter dedicated to women facing abuse and danger, naming it after Emily as a symbol of hope and resilience. The center offered refuge, counseling, and legal aid, everything Emily wished she had when she was trapped and alone. Jake made sure the shelter became a beacon of safety, a place where silence was broken and voices were heard. Though he remained quiet and private, his commitment to helping others was loud and clear. One bright afternoon, Emily, Jake, and baby Lucas met at the town's park. There was no need for grand gestures or declarations. They shared a simple moment of understanding, two people connected by a difficult past, bound by respect and gratitude. Jake gently pushed the stroller while Emily watched Lucas's curious eyes follow the fluttering leaves. There was no romance, no complicated emotions, just the quiet strength of friendship and the knowledge that sometimes, the deepest bonds are forged in the fire of hardship. As the camera pulled back, the voiceover spoke softly, "Some battles are fought not with fists, but with compassion." The words lingered, a reminder that kindness can be the fiercest weapon of all. In a world where cruelty often hides behind closed doors, it is empathy and courage that light the way. And for Emily and Lucas, that light promised a future filled with hope, healing, and the chance to write a new story, one where love and compassion would always win. Family is not always about shared blood or names, it's about love, respect, and the actions we take to protect one another. Too often, abuse hides behind closed doors, wrapped in silence and fear, leaving victims trapped in invisible prisons. But the truth is clear, no one should suffer alone. If you or someone you know is facing harm, it's crucial to recognize the signs, whether it's sudden withdrawal, unexplained injuries, or someone living in constant fear. These are cries for help, silent but urgent, and they deserve to be heard. Speaking up isn't easy. It takes courage to break the silence and challenge the darkness. Yet, one voice, one act of kindness, can change everything. It can save a life, restore hope, and rewrite the story of someone who believed they had no future. Compassion has power, more than we often realize, and when we stand together, we create a world where safety and love are not privileges, but rights.